Imagine standing on a hill, surveying the land that you are supposed to defend, only to realize the map you've been given points you in the completely wrong direction. This was the reality for American forces during one of the lesser-known, but strikingly absurd moments of the War of 1812. In the summer of 1812, tensions between the United States and Britain had escalated into open conflict. While the main theaters of war are often remembered for their epic battles and heroic tales, smaller, seemingly inconsequential errors frequently altered the course of events in ways that history textbooks rarely note. One such moment unfolded in the northern frontier, where a poorly drawn map, a series of miscommunications, and an overconfident commander combined to create a perfect storm of military mismanagement. The fort in question, known at the time as Fort Presque Isle, was a strategically important outpost near Lake Erie. Its location was intended to control key waterways and serve as a staging ground for further operations into British-held Canada. The fort itself was modest in size, a collection of wooden palisades, a few earthworks, and a handful of cannons that, on paper, were meant to deter any attacking force. However, the reality of early 19th century cartography was that maps were often inaccurate, inconsistent, and sometimes wildly misleading. American forces assigned to Fort Presque Isle received a map that was hastily drawn and riddled with errors. Distances were off by miles, landmarks were misplaced, and some of the key defensive positions were shown in the wrong order. The officers, unfamiliar with the rugged terrain, relied heavily on this document for planning troop movements and defensive strategies. Their assumptions were simple but fatal. The map was correct. The terrain would conform to expectations, and the enemy would act predictably. As preparations for potential British engagement intensified, the commander, a young and ambitious officer named Lieutenant Colonel James Miller, faced the daunting task of positioning his troops. Miller was known for his meticulous attention to routine and logistics, yet he was also prone to overconfidence when relying on official documents. On June 11, 1812, he ordered a march to secure the northern approach to the fort, believing that a natural ridgeline shown on the map would offer a strong defensive advantage. The soldiers set out at dawn, boots sinking into the uneven, forested ground, unaware that the ridge they sought did not exist where the map indicated. Instead, they found themselves navigating dense underbrush, marshy ground, and treacherous slopes that slowed their progress and disrupted unique cohesion. Communications between squads became fragmented, messengers got lost, and orders intended for one group never reached another. By mid-morning, what was supposed to be a coordinated deployment had devolved into a disorganized, vulnerable formation, adding to the chaos. Local scouts, native guides familiar with the territory had been consulted but largely ignored. Their warnings about swamps, hidden ravines, and impassable terrain were dismissed as overly cautious. The American officers, confident in the authority of their maps, insisted on following the official routes. This decision would prove disastrous. Meanwhile, the British forces, though significantly smaller in number, observed the unfolding missteps with growing amusement and strategic calculation. They had long understood the limitations of American reconnaissance and mapping in the region. British scouts provided accurate intelligence about the American positions, while their troops prepared to exploit the confusion. By the time Miller's units reached the designated ridge, where they expected to find clear ground suitable for defensive operations, they were already fatigued, disoriented, and spread thin across uneven terrain. The first signs of trouble came in the form of supply shortages. Soldiers had carried provisions sufficient for a normal march, but the unexpected detours and slow progress meant food and water ran low, much faster than anticipated. Cannons, difficult to maneuver even under ideal conditions, became nearly impossible to transport over the swampy soil. Ammunition had to be rationed carefully, and morale began to dip as men recognized that their advantageous position on the map was, in reality, a series of bogs and fallen trees. As the sun began to set, the fort itself was not yet secured. Miller faced a critical decision: push forward to occupy the ridge that did not exist, or retreat to a more defensible position closer to the fort. His officers were divided. Some argued that hesitation would invite a British attack, while others urged caution. Miller, believing that action was preferable to inaction, decided to continue the march. It was this decision, rooted in reliance on a flawed map, that set the stage for one of the most ridiculous, yet historically significant, military mistakes of the War of 1812. By nightfall, the units were scattered across the unfamiliar terrain. Communications had completely broken down. The once clear objective, fortifying a position along the ridge, was now a vague goal lost amid the shadows of the forest. Soldiers took shelter where they could, some improvising defensive positions in the middle of bogs, others trying to make sense of the chaotic orders. The night was long, uncomfortable, and filled with anxiety. And yet, despite the mounting confusion, Miller remained convinced that dawn would bring clarity. He believed the map, after all, could not be wrong. But maps, as it turns out, are only as reliable as the cartographers who draw them and the commanders who trust them blindly. As the first light of morning broke over the misty landscape, it became apparent that the American forces were not in a defensible position at all. The ridge was in the wrong place, their supplies were dangerously low, and the British forces were already maneuvering to exploit the confusion. At that moment, a critical question emerged. How could an army so meticulously organized, with trained officers and disciplined troops, be undone entirely by a simple misreading of a map? This question would haunt Miller and his men, shaping the narratives of historians who later examined the incident. But it also serves as a reminder of the fragile chain of human decision-making in war. The consequences of this error were immediate and tangible. While the Americans did eventually retreat and secure the fort, the missteps delayed reinforcements, allowed the British to gain temporary tactical advantages in the surrounding area, and expose vulnerabilities that might have been avoided with accurate mapping. Soldiers who endured the exhausting march recounted tales of confusion, fatigue, and frustration, accounts that historians later used to reconstruct the event. But even more intriguing than the tactical fallout was the human element. Soldiers had placed their trust in maps, orders, and officers. Officers had relied on documents that were supposed to provide certainty in a chaotic environment. And yet, despite all this, one small error, a misdrawn ridge, a wrong coordinate, a faulty line on paper demonstrated how fragile even the best laid plans could be. As you consider the implications of Miller's reliance on a flawed map, it raises another thought. Could modern military planners, with advanced technology and GPS, ever fully eliminate the type of error that ruined Fort Presque-Isle's defense? Or is human misjudgment, in some form, inevitable in every conflict? By dawn, the reality of the previous night's errors became painfully clear. The ridge that promised security on paper was nothing but a series of treacherous bogs and uneven terrain, and the soldiers, exhausted from a night of disorientation, were about to face the consequences of following a flawed map. The morning sun revealed a landscape that seemed almost mocking in its clarity. What Lieutenant Colonel James Miller had assumed would be a strong defensive position was, in fact, a network of marshes, fallen trees, and narrow paths that could neither support the movement of men nor the weight of artillery. The troops, still fatigued from the night's chaotic march, began to realize the severity of their situation. The morale that had been tenuous during the night plummeted further. As the soldiers grappled with the physical and mental strain of their predicament, Miller quickly called a council of officers to reassess their position. The debate was heated as opinions diverged sharply. Some officers argued that they should retreat immediately to the fort, using the natural defenses around it to regroup and prepare for a British assault. Others insisted on pressing forward, hoping that a show of initiative might still salvage the mission and provide some semblance of the ridge depicted on the map. Miller, aware that any delay could embolden the British forces, ultimately decided to advance cautiously, attempting to maintain cohesion despite the logistical nightmares surrounding him. The movement forward, however, quickly revealed the limitations of their plan. The marshy ground slowed the soldiers, forcing them into a stretched and vulnerable formation. Cannons, essential for the fort's defense, became mired in the mud, requiring dozens of men to pull each one forward inch by inch. The sound of men straining against the earth, combined with the groans of exhausted horses, created a haunting symphony of struggle and frustration. Letters and personal journals from soldiers recount these moments vividly, describing the helplessness of being caught between duty and the unforgiving terrain. Meanwhile, British scouts observed the Americans struggle from vantage points on nearby ridges and hills. They could see the dispersed formations, the struggling artillery, and the fatigue etched on the faces of the troops. Reports were sent back to their commanders, who began devising a plan to exploit the Americans' weakened position. Unlike the Americans, the British forces had the advantage of accurate local maps and experienced guides who knew every marsh, ravine, and forested path. This discrepancy in intelligence created a situation ripe for disaster. By mid-morning, the first signs of direct confrontation appeared. Small skirmishes broke out as British scouts and advanced units probed the American lines. These encounters, although minor in scale, further disoriented the already stretched American formations. Miscommunications compounded the problem. Orders from Miller sometimes arrived hours late or were misunderstood entirely. Units that were supposed to support each other found themselves isolated, and the soldiers began improvising defenses wherever they could, often in positions that provided little actual advantage. The human toll of the mismanaged march became increasingly evident. Soldiers complained of cramps, exhaustion, and dehydration. Some had been forced to wade through marshes that soaked their clothing and equipment, leaving them vulnerable to cold and disease. Horses, crucial for moving artillery and supplies, began to falter under the weight and strain, further hampering mobility. Supplies, already limited, were now stretched to the breaking point. Officers did what they could to maintain order and morale, but their authority was undermined by the tangible evidence of failure. The landscape itself had become an adversary, and the men's trust in their leadership wavered. Amid this chaos, Miller attempted to regain some semblance of control. He issued a series of directives intended to consolidate the scattered units and create makeshift defensive positions. These positions, often hastily constructed from fallen logs, mud, and whatever materials were at hand, offered only limited protection. Yet, Miller's presence among the men walking the lines, issuing orders, and attempting to inspire confidence provided a small measure of reassurance. Historical accounts note that his calm demeanor, even in the face of overwhelming confusion, prevented total panic and maintained a fragile sense of order. The turning point of the day came when a British unit, having observed the Americans' disarray, launched a coordinated maneuver to encircle part of Miller's force. The Americans, exhausted and poorly positioned, struggled to respond effectively. Orders were shouted across the marsh, but the combination of distance, fatigue, and the cacophony of movement meant that many instructions went unheard or were misunderstood. Soldiers who had expected to hold a ridge now found themselves flanked and vulnerable. In these tense hours, the consequences of the initial map error became undeniable. A simple misreading, or rather, unquestioned acceptance of a flawed map, had placed hundreds of soldiers in jeopardy. Supplies were dwindling, artillery was ineffective in the boggy terrain, and the troops' morale hung by a thread. Yet, despite these setbacks, there was no outright panic. The discipline instilled by training and the leadership of officers like Miller prevented total collapse, demonstrating the resilience and adaptability of the soldiers even under absurdly unfavorable circumstances. As the British probe intensified, Miller faced a critical decision. Should he attempt a risky counterattack, hoping to reclaim some tactical advantage, or consolidate his forces and prepare for an organized retreat back to the fort? Each choice carried significant risks. The counterattack could result in catastrophic losses if the troops failed to coordinate effectively, while retreat could invite pursuit and further casualties. The morning's events set the stage for an extraordinary lesson and military history. That even a relatively small error, a misdrawn ridge, a miscalculated path, or a misread map can escalate into a situation with profound operational consequences. The soldiers' endurance, leadership under pressure, and ability to improvise became as crucial as any formal battle strategy. And yet, even as the Americans struggled, one lingering question remained. Could Lieutenant Colonel Miller find a way to turn this chaos into a defensible position? Or was the fort doomed to fall because of a simple human error repeated at every level of command? By midday, the absurdity of relying on a flawed map became painfully tangible. What began as a simple navigational error had escalated into a full-scale test of discipline, leadership, and human endurance. With the fate of Fort Presque Isle hanging in the balance, the morning haze lifted to reveal a battlefield that was simultaneously comical in its origin and tragic in its potential consequences. American soldiers, still weary from their night of disorientation and misdirected marching, faced the reality that the British forces had moved swiftly to capitalize on their vulnerability. Units that were supposed to support one another had been separated by marshes and fallen trees, leaving pockets of soldiers isolated and exposed. Lieutenant Colonel James Miller, aware of the impending threat, moved quickly to consolidate his men. He ordered a series of defensive positions using whatever terrain was available. Fallen logs were stacked into crude barricades, swampy patches were reinforced with earthworks dug hastily by exhausted troops, and soldiers were positioned to cover the narrow passages that could be defended. While these improvisations were far from ideal, they allowed the Americans to hold a semblance of formation against the advancing British forces. The British attack began in earnest mid-afternoon. Their forces, smaller but more strategically positioned, probed the American defenses, looking for weaknesses to exploit. Cannon fire echoed across the marshlands, though many American guns, still partially mired in mud, could only respond sporadically. The soldiers, however, demonstrated remarkable resilience. Despite exhaustion, confusion, and the absurdity of their predicament, they fought with determination, using every advantage that the terrain allowed, even if it was limited and poorly understood. Interestingly, this battle, born of miscommunication and miscalculation, highlighted the adaptability of human strategy in warfare. Soldiers had to improvise on the fly, creating defensive lines where none should have existed, and officers had to make decisions with incomplete information. Each skirmish, each decision, was amplified by the initial error of trusting a flawed map. What could have been a swift disaster turned into a prolonged engagement that tested the ingenuity and stamina of both sides. By late afternoon, Miller made a critical decision, recognizing that hold in the flawed position indefinitely would risk catastrophic losses. He ordered a controlled withdrawal toward the fort. This maneuver was risky. Retreating under fire in difficult terrain often leads to disarray and high casualties. Yet, the Americans executed it with surprising efficiency. Thanks in large part to Miller's leadership and the soldiers' discipline, cannons were dragged carefully. Men covered each other's movements, and small units held choke points long enough to allow the main body to retreat. The British, while initially poised to exploit the Americans' misfortune, found themselves confronted with unexpectedly organized resistance. They pressed the attack cautiously, wary of overextending their forces in the treacherous marshes. By the time the Americans reached the fort, the engagement had cost both sides more time and energy than anyone anticipated. The fort itself remained in American hands, but the error of the map and the ensuing chaos left lasting impressions on the officers and soldiers involved. Historians analyzing the incident often emphasize the irony. A simple misdrawn ridge line on a map, a small error by a cartographer, had nearly led to the fort's fall. Yet, human resilience, quick thinking, and disciplined improvisation transformed what could have been a disaster into a moment of survival and tactical learning. Personal accounts from soldiers recall the frustration, fatigue, and absurdity of the situation, but also a sense of pride in overcoming seemingly impossible odds. The incident at Fort Presque Isle also had long-term consequences. Commanders learned the vital importance of local intelligence, the limits of blindly trusting maps, and the necessity of adaptability in unpredictable conditions. Training protocols were revised, and future officers were reminded that the smallest oversight like a misread map can cascade into large-scale operational challenges. The story became a cautionary tale, not for its glory or heroism, but for its illustration of how minor human errors can ripple through history in surprising ways. Reflecting on this event, it is clear that mistakes are an inherent part of human endeavors, even in the rigorously structured world of military operations. The soldier's experience shows that while planning and preparation are essential, the ability to adapt, improvise, and persevere is equally critical. Maps can guide us, but they cannot replace judgment, intuition, and the resilience of the human spirit. The War of 1812 may be remembered for grand battles and celebrated heroes, but it is these smaller, seemingly ridiculous mistakes that often reveal the most about human nature and the realities of war. A misread map, exhaustion, and a misjudged path elements that might seem minor created a scenario where ordinary soldiers displayed extraordinary endurance. It reminds us that history is not just the story of victories and losses, but also of the fragile and unpredictable chain of decisions that shape outcomes. Imagine the deafening roar of cannons not from the enemy, but from your own side. On a fateful day during the Revolutionary War, American soldiers faced exactly this nightmare. Artillery fire that should have protected them instead threatened to destroy them. The chaos of battle is often thought of as the enemy attacking relentlessly, but history shows that some of the most harrowing moments come from confusion within one's own ranks. One such example occurred during the Revolutionary War in 1777 at a little-known skirmish near the Hudson River. Though overshadowed by major campaigns like Saratoga or Valley Forge, this incident illustrates how miscommunication, poor coordination, and the fog of war can create moments of near disaster. At the time, American forces were attempting to control key points along the Hudson, preventing British reinforcements from advancing southward. Artillery units, still a relatively new component of the American military, were positioned on strategic hills to cover advancing infantry. Commanders relied heavily on signals, flags, drums, and messengers to coordinate these mobile units in the midst of battle. Yet, the combination of smoke, shouting, and misread signals would turn a disciplined operation into a disaster in waiting. Captain Thomas Harding, commanding a battery of 6 cannons, had received instructions to target a specific location ahead of the advancing infantry. Maps of the area were imprecise, and the topography was more complex than the written order suggested. Hills, ravines, and thick woods created visual barriers that made line-of-sight targeting nearly impossible. Harding, known for his meticulous attention to detail, found himself relying on both intuition and the judgment of his subordinates. The infantry, meanwhile, was advancing in a staggered formation designed to minimize exposure to enemy fire. Communication between units was already strained. Officers shouted orders over the din of the battlefield, but echoes, smoke, and the natural chaos of men moving over uneven ground meant that many instructions were delayed, misinterpreted, or entirely lost. This gap in coordination created a scenario ripe for disaster. It was in this context that the first cannon was fired not at the enemy, but inadvertently at the advancing American troops. The reason was a simple misalignment. Harding's assistant misread the coordinates given by the commanding officer, and the crew adjusted the cannon slightly to the left, unknowingly directing it into the path of their own soldiers. The result was immediate. Men ducking and scattering, shouted warnings, and chaos among the ranks. Some soldiers were grazed by cannonballs or struck by debris, adding injury and panic to an already tense situation. What followed was a tense period of hesitation. Harding realized the error almost immediately, but struggled to communicate the correction. Amidst the clamor of the battlefield, messengers ran back and forth, trying to convey the change in orders. But the noise and movement made clear communication nearly impossible. Each subsequent cannon discharge risked repeating the same mistake. Yet the artillery crew was under pressure to maintain a defensive and offensive posture, lest the enemy seize the advantage. In the background, British forces watched the unfolding confusion with both caution and opportunism. While they had planned their attack expecting resistance, the sight of American units disrupted by their own artillery presented an unexpected advantage. The British commanders, understanding the value of timing, held their troops in check, allowing the Americans to potentially correct their errors or further entangle themselves in the disaster. Soldiers caught in the crossfire recalled the surreal feeling of being targeted by their own side. Personal letters from the period describe a mixture of fear, disbelief, and frustration. One infantryman wrote, "We ran as if pursued by ghosts of our own men. The roar of our guns charged against us, and yet no enemy dared approach." This personal perspective provides a glimpse into the human side of military mishaps that official records often downplay or omit, compounding the situation were logistical challenges. Ammunition, already in limited supply, was difficult to move safely amidst the disorder. Cannons, heavy and unwieldy even under normal circumstances, require precise handling to avoid further accidents. The men worked feverishly to reposition them while attempting to maintain some semblance of order. In the infantry ranks, every decision carried the weight of potential catastrophe. Meanwhile, Captain Harding, acutely aware of the consequences of another misfire, implemented an ad hoc solution. He stationed additional officers to oversee the firing process, instructed crews to double-check each alignment, and emphasized visual verification of friendly troop positions. These adjustments, though simple, exemplified the importance of real-time problem-solving on the battlefield. The mistake of the morning had highlighted not only the perils of miscommunication, but also the adaptability and quick thinking required of commanders under duress. Yet, despite these efforts, a larger question loomed. How could a military force, still in its formative stages and facing an experienced adversary, ensure that such blunders did not occur in future engagements? The incident serves as an early lesson in coordination, the importance of accurate maps, and the necessity of reliable communication and warfare, a lesson that would resonate throughout American military history. As the day progressed, the troops began to regain their composure. Adjustments to artillery placement and clearer communication lines gradually reduced the risk of firing on their own forces. By late afternoon, the Americans had restored a measure of order, and the skirmish evolved into a more conventional confrontation with the British. Though no decisive victory was achieved, the immediate danger of friendly fire had been averted, leaving soldiers with a profound respect for the delicate balance of planning, coordination, and execution in military operations. The incident also provides a rare window into the human experience of battle. Beyond strategy and tactics, the story reveals how fear, confusion, and split-second decisions shape outcomes. Even in a war dominated by larger battles and famous generals, these smaller, chaotic episodes profoundly affected morale, perception, and the practical conduct of military campaigns. The morning's chaos was only the beginning. By midday, the consequences of misaligned artillery rippled through the ranks, turning what should have been a controlled skirmish into a test of nerves, leadership, and sheer survival. After the initial misfire that struck American soldiers, the field became a tense scene of confusion and cautious maneuvering. Officers moved swiftly to correct the errors, but the battlefield, thick with smoke, mud, and shouting, made precision almost impossible. Captain Thomas Harding's artillery crews worked frantically to realign their guns, while messengers scurried across the lines, delivering urgent instructions to infantry units now wary of their own cannons as much as the enemy. The soldiers, though shaken, had no choice but to continue advancing. Retreat was not an option. Ceding ground would allow the British to exploit gaps and potentially outflank American positions. Men gritted their teeth and pressed forward, navigating the chaos, improvising where terrain and orders failed them. This dual threat, enemy forces ahead and their own artillery behind, created a surreal and anxiety-laden environment. The British, initially taken aback by the American mishap, quickly adapted. Skirmishers advanced cautiously, probing weaknesses in the lines without triggering the panic that a reckless charge might have caused. Their disciplined approach contrasted sharply with the Americans' disarray, highlighting how even minor errors can shift the tactical advantage. Each miscommunication, each hesitant movement by the Americans, provided an opportunity for the British to test the resolve of their opponents and exploit gaps without risking major casualties. Within the American ranks, tension mounted. Soldiers whispered warnings to one another, unsure whether to trust orders or rely on instinct. The field had become a lesson in skepticism. Nothing could be assumed, not even the reliability of their own side's weapons. Letters and diaries from the period describe the surreal nature of the day. Men recalling the fear of being targeted by their own artillery, the shock of seeing comrades take cover from American cannon fire, and the urgent instinctive need to stay alive amid the chaos. Captain Harding, aware of the stakes, made another critical decision. He placed experienced observers along the front lines to signal the approach of any troops, ensuring that artillery crews could hold fire until friendly forces were clearly identified. This innovation, though born of necessity, exemplifies the kind of on-the-fly problem-solving that often determines survival in battle. Communication, coordination, and human judgment became as vital as any strategic plan, illustrating a fundamental principle of warfare. Errors can be mitigated only through adaptability and vigilance. As the hours wore on, both sides experienced the fatigue and strain of continuous engagement. The Americans' initial panic slowly gave way to cautious confidence. Soldiers adjusted to the rhythm of battle, anticipating the positions of both comrades and enemy forces. The British, recognizing the Americans' growing organization, advanced with calculated restraint, probing for weaknesses rather than launching an all-out assault. The day's engagements became a delicate dance, a mixture of offense and defense where timing and observation outweigh brute force. Despite these adjustments, the incident left lasting scars on the soldiers' morale. Even minor errors in artillery alignment became exaggerated in memory, stories that were retold with a mixture of humor, horror, and disbelief. Some soldiers began to question their reliance on orders, maps, and procedures, realizing that human error could have consequences as deadly as enemy fire. This recognition shaped future approaches to coordination, training, and battlefield communication, influencing military practices long after the skirmish ended. By late afternoon, the Americans managed to stabilize their positions, securing key points along the battlefield while minimizing further risk of friendly fire. Harding's adjustments had prevented additional accidents, and disciplined infantry formations began to push forward, cautiously testing the British lines. The threat of artillery misalignment still loomed, but careful observation and coordination allowed the Americans to regain some control over their operations. However, the skirmish was far from over. The British, having observed the Americans' vulnerability, prepared a targeted maneuver aimed at exploiting any remaining confusion. The stage was set for a confrontation where quick thinking, coordination, and sheer nerve would determine which side would claim the upper hand. Lieutenant Colonel Harding and his fellow officers knew that every decision in the next few hours could be decisive, and the memory of the morning's blunders weighed heavily on them. The incident raises an enduring question in the heat of battle, where mistakes compound rapidly and chaos reigns. How can soldiers maintain composure and make decisions that preserve both life and mission objectives? The answer lies not in strategy alone, but in leadership, communication, and the ability to adapt under pressure, a lesson written in sweat, fear, and cannon smoke on that fateful Revolutionary War field. By late afternoon, the battlefield had transformed from chaos into a tense standoff. The Americans had survived their own cannons, but the outcome of the skirmish and the lessons learned were only just becoming clear. The Americans, still recovering from the morning's disastrous misfire, faced a critical test. The soldiers had endured confusion, fear, and injuries caused not by the enemy, but by their own artillery, and now they had to confront both their shaken morale and the advancing British forces. Lieutenant Colonel Harding, aware that hesitation could lead to catastrophe, moved decisively to organize a defensive line near the original strategic positions, using high ground and natural obstacles. Harding's officers positioned infantry units to cover key approaches while the artillery crews, now carefully supervised, were redeployed to maximize range without endangering friendly forces. Soldiers were instructed to observe strict firing protocols, ensuring that each shot was aimed only after confirming the positions of their comrades. The level of attention and coordination was painstaking, but it was necessary to prevent further disaster. The British, seeing the Americans regroup, launched a probing attack to test the integrity of their defenses. Skirmishes erupted along the front lines as soldiers on both sides sought advantageous positions. American troops, though still wary from earlier mishaps, executed defensive maneuvers with surprising precision. Their discipline under pressure mitigated what could have been a devastating blow, allowing the Americans to maintain a precarious balance on the battlefield. Casualties remained relatively low compared to what might have occurred without these adjustments, but the psychological impact was significant. Soldiers recalled the terrifying experience of nearly being struck by their own cannon fire, and the day's events became ingrained in memory as a cautionary tale. Diaries and letters from the time describe the surreal combination of relief, disbelief, and renewed determination that followed the stabilization of the line. Captain Harding's leadership was central to this recovery. By personally overseeing artillery, realignment, implementing additional verification procedures, and maintaining clear lines of communication, he prevented further mistakes and restored confidence among the troops. His actions demonstrated the importance of adaptive leadership, the ability to respond to unforeseen circumstances quickly, decisively, and with practical solutions. As evening approached, the British forces withdrew slightly, recognizing that further engagement without adequate intelligence would be risky. The Americans, though fatigued, held their positions. The battle had not produced a clear victor, but it had provided critical lessons in coordination, communication, and trust in the midst of chaos. The soldiers' ability to adapt and survive despite their own artillery's threat highlighted the resilience and ingenuity often overlooked in military history. In the aftermath, commanders on both sides reflected on the incident. For the Americans, it underscored the necessity of rigorous training and strict protocols for artillery operation. For the British, it was a reminder that even an inferior force could exploit confusion and human error. More broadly, historians note that the skirmish illustrates a fundamental truth of warfare. Victory and survival often hinge less on brute force than on clarity, communication, and the capacity to respond to the unexpected. This seemingly minor incident, cannons misfiring on friendly troops, has been overshadowed in popular history by larger battles and celebrated heroes, yet it provides invaluable insight into the human element of war, the capacity for error, the importance of leadership, and the resilience of ordinary soldiers in extraordinary circumstances. The day's events remain a vivid example of how mistakes can cascade, yet still be mitigated through discipline and quick thinking. Reflecting on the skirmish, one realizes that, even when faced with chaos born of one's own errors, human adaptability can prevail. Soldiers learn to trust both their training and their judgment. Commanders learned the value of oversight and communication, and history gained a story that, while ridiculous in its origins, illuminates enduring lessons about warfare, leadership, and resilience. Imagine marching confidently into the woods, expecting to engage the enemy, only to discover that the danger was waiting for you precisely where your commander thought it wouldn't be. This is the story of how American forces unknowingly walked straight into an ambush. one of the most avoidable yet shocking blunders in early American military history. It was the late summer of 1778, during the height of the Revolutionary War. American troops, tasked with defending a critical supply route in the dense forests of New Jersey, were preparing to intercept a British detachment believed to be moving to reinforce outposts in the region. The mission, on paper, seemed straightforward: position forces along a known path, engage the enemy, and secure the route for essential supplies and reinforcements. The American forces were composed largely of militia, supplemented by a handful of Continental Army regulars. Many soldiers were veterans of prior campaigns, but others were young men experiencing their first real taste of battlefield discipline. Command rested in the hands of a colonel, known for strict adherence to orders, yet less experienced in reading complex terrain and interpreting incomplete intelligence. The night before the march, scouts were dispatched to survey the route, but dense fog and heavy undergrowth made their task nearly impossible. Reports were vague. The path appeared clear, with only minor obstacles noted, and no sign of British movement was detected. Officers, relying on these preliminary reports and their own assumptions, concluded that the troops could advance without fear of a surprise attack. Confidence in the plan was high at dawn. The soldiers set out in formation, boots sinking into the damp earth, muskets at the ready. Their spirits were a mixture of determination and apprehension. Though most trusted the guidance of their leaders, the march began smoothly enough, with units keeping to the prescribed path through the forested terrain. Mist clung to the trees, muffling sounds and giving the forest an eerie stillness that, in hindsight, should have served as a warning. As the morning wore on, subtle signs of danger began to appear. Branches snapped in the distance, small flashes of movement hinted at unseen figures, and the usual sounds of wildlife seemed to have vanished. Yet, these were dismissed as minor distractions, typical for a forested march. The colonel and his officers reassured themselves that the path was secure, unaware that British forces had anticipated their movements. The British, well acquainted with the terrain and guided by loyal local informants, had prepared a classic ambush. They chose a narrow, tree-lined section of the path, creating choke points where musket fire and cavalry charges could be devastatingly effective. Artillery pieces, light and mobile, were hidden behind foliage, ready to strike at the most vulnerable point of the advancing column. Every aspect of the trap was meticulously calculated to maximize confusion and casualties. As the American soldiers entered the trap, the ambush was sprung. Musket fire erupted from concealed positions, cutting through the formation with terrifying precision. Officers shouted commands, but the forest amplified chaos. Sounds were distorted, smoke obscured vision, and the disciplined line that had marched so confidently moments before dissolved into a panicked scramble. Soldiers ducked behind trees, fired blindly toward the source of the attack, and attempted to rally under impossible conditions. The impact of the ambush was immediate and severe. Casualties mounted quickly, and communication within the ranks nearly collapsed. Some units, separated by dense undergrowth and fallen trees, were unable to coordinate with neighboring units. Messengers sent to convey orders were often intercepted or delayed, compounding the confusion. The psychological toll on the soldiers was immense. Many recount a surreal experience of facing an unseen enemy from all directions, feeling trapped in a deadly maze orchestrated by the British. Despite the initial shock, a few officers and soldiers demonstrated remarkable composure. They formed small defensive groups, using trees and natural obstacles to shield themselves from musket fire. Quick-thinking individuals helped drag wounded comrades to relative safety and repositioned. Artillery were possible. These acts of courage and ingenuity prevented what could have been a total rout. Yet, the ambush exposed critical flaws in American planning: reliance on incomplete intelligence, assumptions about terrain, and failure to anticipate the enemy's knowledge of local geography left the troops vulnerable. The incident serves as a stark reminder that even experienced soldiers and disciplined units can be undone by overconfidence and poor reconnaissance. The The aftermath of the initial ambush set the stage for the day's unfolding drama. The colonel, recognizing the magnitude of the error, had to make a critical decision. Attempt to force a counterattack through the ambush, risking further casualties, or conduct a tactical withdrawal under fire, preserving as many men as possible while ceding ground to the enemy. Each option carried risks, and each choice would test the soldiers' endurance, leadership, and ability to adapt in real time. As the smoke cleared from the initial volley, one haunting question lingered in the minds of those who survived. How could a unit so well organized, following carefully laid plans, be led directly into an ambush that seemed so obvious in hindsight? This question underscores a recurring theme in military history: the thin line between careful planning and catastrophic misjudgment, and how human error often plays a decisive role in the fate of armies. The forest that seemed peaceful moments ago had transformed into a deadly labyrinth. Every snap of a branch and every echo of musket fire reminded the American soldiers that they were trapped, and that survival now depended on quick thinking, improvisation, and courage under fire. After the initial shock of the ambush, the American soldiers were forced to confront the immediate consequences of their misjudgment. Units that had marched confidently through the forest were now scattered and disoriented, some pinned down by enemy fire, others seeking cover among trees, fallen logs, and uneven terrain. The initial plan to intercept the British had vanished in an instant, replaced by the urgent need to survive. Captain Samuel Harper, one of the few officers who had anticipated the possibility of an ambush, began moving among the scattered units, shouting orders and coordinating defensive positions. His experience and calm under pressure proved invaluable. Soldiers followed his instructions to create makeshift barricades and choke points, where musket fire could be concentrated effectively. Though improvised, these positions provided enough cover to slow the British advance and prevent a complete rout. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Colonel Jonathan Price, the commanding officer, faced a difficult decision. He could attempt the counterattack, hoping to break through the ambush and regain the initiative, or he could order a tactical withdrawal to safer terrain. Both options were perilous. A counterattack risked heavy casualties in unfamiliar terrain under enemy fire, while a retreat could easily descend into chaos if coordination failed. After a tense council of officers, Price decided on a cautious withdrawal, prioritizing the preservation of manpower over immediate engagement. Executing a withdrawal under these conditions was extraordinarily challenging. Soldiers had to move carefully to avoid exposure to musket fire, while maintaining enough cohesion to prevent panic. Small groups of men covered each other's movements, firing selectively at advancing British units. Artillery, limited in mobility due to the forested terrain, was repositioned wherever possible, providing intermittent support without endangering friendly forces. The careful balance between offense and defense exemplified the soldiers' adaptability and discipline in a situation that might have overwhelmed less experienced troops. Despite these efforts, casualties mounted. Some soldiers were hit while attempting to cover the retreat of their comrades. Others were injured navigating the difficult terrain. The psychological strain of fighting in close quarters against an unseen enemy amplified the physical exhaustion, creating a tense, almost surreal battlefield environment. Letters from soldiers recount moments of fear and confusion, the deafening roar of musket fire, the eerie silence between volleys, and the haunting sense that every shadow could conceal danger. The British forces, confident in their initial advantage, attempted to press the Americans further. They deployed light cavalry and skirmishers to harass the retreating units, seeking to exploit the scattered formations. However, the Americans' adaptive measures, small defensive pockets, careful cover fire, and constant communication among officers slowed the British advance and prevented a complete collapse. This dynamic illustrated a critical lesson: even when misled into a trap, disciplined troops can mitigate disaster through improvisation, leadership, and teamwork. As the day progressed, the American soldiers began to regroup in more defensible positions, the colonel ordered the remaining units to form a compact defensive line along a ridge that offered natural cover and better visibility. This new formation allowed the troops to consolidate their strength, control the high ground, and coordinate artillery fire more effectively. The initial ambush, while devastating, had forced the soldiers to learn, adapt, and implement rapid problem-solving under extreme stress, a testament to human resilience in the face of error. The experience also highlighted the critical importance of intelligence, reconnaissance, and terrain awareness. Earlier reliance on incomplete scouting reports had left the soldiers vulnerable, and the ambush underscored how even experienced officers could misjudge enemy intentions. In the aftermath, military historians emphasize that battles were often decided not solely by force or numbers, but by the ability to anticipate, respond, and adapt when plans went awry. Amid the regrouping, soldiers exchanged stories and reflections about the ambush. Some spoke of the terror of facing fire from all directions. Others marveled at their comrades' bravery and quick thinking. These personal accounts, preserved in letters and diaries, provide invaluable insight into the human dimension of warfare, fear, ingenuity, and camaraderie coexisting in the crucible of battle. Yet despite the gradual stabilization of their lines, one question lingered. Could the Americans capitalize on their recovery to turn the ambush into an opportunity? Or would the British forces experienced and opportunistic continue to exploit the confusion to inflict further damage? The answer would determine not only the outcome of this skirmish, but also the broader implications for the control of the critical supply route along the Hudson. The forest was still thick with smoke and tension, but the American soldiers had one chance to turn the chaos into survival. Every decision now would decide whether they emerged victorious or became another tragic footnote in the Revolutionary War. By late afternoon, the scattered American units had managed to regroup along a ridge that offered a slightly more defensible position. Lieutenant Colonel Jonathan Price and Captain Samuel Harper moved among the men, directing placements, reinforcing weak points, and coordinating musket and artillery fire. The ambush that had thrown them into disarray now faced a disciplined, adaptive force that had learned quickly from its earlier mistakes. The British, expecting the Americans to crumble completely, were met with organized resistance. The compact defensive formation along the ridge allowed the Americans to concentrate their fire effectively. Using natural cover and improvised barricades, soldiers fired selectively, targeting advancing British units while minimizing exposure to crossfire. This combination of tactical awareness and sheer determination slowed the British advance and forced them to reconsider their approach. The battle intensified as both sides tested each other's resolve. British skirmishers attempted to flank the ridge, but the Americans anticipated these moves, adjusting their positions and repelling the attackers with coordinated volleys. Artillery, repositioned carefully after the morning chaos, began delivering more precise fire, creating confusion among the British ranks and providing a much-needed psychological boost to the American soldiers. Despite their recovery, the Americans paid a heavy toll. Casualties were significant, and exhaustion weighed heavily on every soldier. Many had been on their feet for hours, navigating rough terrain, firing under pressure, and improvising defenses while carrying the memory of the morning's deadly surprise. Yet, the human spirit proved resilient. Soldiers who moments before had feared annihilation now pressed on, relying on training, leadership, and the trust they had in their comrades. The tide began to turn slowly. The British, recognizing that the ambush had failed to achieve its intended result, gradually withdrew, seeking safer engagement positions. This retreat allowed the Americans to consolidate their hold on the ridge and secure the supply route, though at a significant cost in lives and morale. What could have been a devastating rout had instead become a hard-won survival, and a valuable lesson in military prudence. In the aftermath, historians emphasize the broader implications of this seemingly minor skirmish. The incident revealed that overconfidence, incomplete intelligence, and assumptions about terrain could be as dangerous as enemy forces. It also illustrated that adaptability, courage, and leadership could compensate for initial errors, allowing soldiers to survive and even prevail under dire circumstances. The lessons learned here influenced American military strategy in subsequent campaigns, highlighting the importance of reconnaissance, flexible planning, and the capacity to respond to unexpected threats. The personal dimension of the battle also left its mark. Soldiers who survived recounted the terror of walking into a trap, the surreal experience of facing death from both enemy and environment, and the camaraderie that emerged from shared adversity. These accounts, preserved in letters and diaries, provide insight into the human experience of war, emphasizing that even in boring or minor engagements, the stakes and the lessons were profoundly significant. Reflecting on this event, one sees that history is often shaped not only by brilliant maneuvers and decisive victories, but also by errors, misjudgments, and the capacity of ordinary individuals to adapt and survive. The ambush serves as a reminder that even in moments of seeming disaster, resilience and quick thinking can alter the course of events. For the American soldiers in the forests of New Jersey, survival required more than courage. It required learning from mistakes, trusting one another, and seizing control of circumstances that initially seemed hopeless. Imagine standing on a hill, confident that the enemy is weak, only to discover moments later that your assumptions were disastrously wrong. This is the story of how American forces, fueled by overconfidence and incomplete intelligence, nearly lost an entire battle before it even began. It was the spring of 1779 in the rolling hills of upstate New York. American forces, tasked with defending a strategic pass along a critical river route, were confident in their position. The enemy was believed to be small and poorly equipped, allowing the Americans to adopt a relaxed posture. Scouts reported minimal activity, and the commanding officer, Colonel Benjamin Walker, reassured his men that they were unlikely to face significant resistance. The troops were a mix of militia and Continental Army regulars. Many had served in previous skirmishes, yet the prevailing confidence bordering on complacency permeated the ranks. Soldiers polished their muskets, ranged camp efficiently, and even joked among themselves, unaware that the enemy was not only present but also observing their every move. Colonel Walker, respected for his prior successes, had a critical blind spot. He underestimated the enemy's ability to conceal themselves and mobilize quickly. Reports from scouts were taken at face value, and no contingency plans were developed for a sudden counterattack. The natural terrain, while providing strong defensive positions, also contained hidden ravines and dense forest patches perfect for an ambush or rapid enemy maneuver. At dawn, the Americans began their routine patrols along the pass. The initial calm reinforced their belief that the enemy was minimal or non-existent. Soldiers practiced drills, sharpened bayonets, and reviewed orders in what they perceived as preparation for routine defense, rather than imminent combat. In reality, the enemy forces had been shadowing the Americans for hours, positioning themselves along flanking routes and hidden high ground, ready to exploit any sign of weakness. The first indication of danger came in subtle forms: distant rustling of leaves, faint whistle signals, and occasional glimpses of movement just beyond the tree line. Officers initially dismissed these signs as wildlife or minor disturbances. However, as the morning progressed, these signals intensified. Enemy musket shots began landing just beyond the American pickets, a calculated effort to draw attention while concealing the true size and position of their forces. The Americans, slow to recognize the threat, began to form defensive lines. Men moved to cover the approaches to their position, arranging artillery pieces on elevated ground to command the pass. Cannons were prepared to fire at targets within line of sight. Though visibility was limited by fog and foliage, the troops attempted to maintain discipline, but subtle signs of anxiety began to appear. Soldiers whispered nervously. Officers scanned the tree line repeatedly, and some men hesitated before firing. Colonel Walker attempted to gather intelligence from scattered scouts, but communication breakdowns compounded the problem. Messages were delayed, misinterpreted, or failed to reach the central command point, leaving critical gaps in awareness. Each miscommunication provided the enemy with opportunities to maneuver unnoticed, setting the stage for a confrontation that could easily have turned catastrophic. By mid-morning, the enemy revealed their full presence. A coordinated volley of musket fire erupted from concealed positions along both flanks. The Americans, caught off guard, scrambled to establish firing positions while attempting to protect artillery units and supply wagons. Panic threatened to spread, but quick-thinking officers directed their men into makeshift defensive formations, using natural terrain to offset the enemy's initial advantage. Despite their preparedness, the Americans faced significant challenges. Dense forest limited lines of sight, uneven terrain complicated troop movements, and fatigue from the march left soldiers vulnerable. Casualties began to mount as the enemy pressed the advantage, exploiting every misstep and hesitation. Yet, amid the chaos, acts of improvisation and courage emerged. Small groups of soldiers formed defensive pockets, artillery crews repositioned under fire, and officers risked exposure to rally their men and stabilize the front. The first hour of engagement proved to be the most critical. Every decision, every movement, and every volley carried high stakes. Soldiers had to rely on their instincts and training to navigate confusion, while adapting to the enemy as unpredictable maneuvers. Letters and accounts from participants describe moments of surreal tension, where the line between survival and disaster felt impossibly thin. This early stage of the battle highlights a recurring theme in military history: overconfidence. An incomplete intelligence can transform a seemingly secure situation into near catastrophe, while prior victories and experience can breed confidence. Assumptions about the enemy's strength and capabilities often prove misleading. The Americans learned this lesson the hard way, discovering that vigilance, skepticism, and contingency planning are as critical as courage and skill. Even as officers and soldiers struggled to respond, the enemy's strategy became increasingly apparent. They were testing the Americans' reactions, probing for weaknesses, and exploiting delays in communication. Each movement had been carefully calculated to destabilize the American forces and maximize psychological impact. The situation evolved into a tense game of observation and response, where the human element, the ability to stay calm, improvise, and coordinate, was as decisive as firepower. As the morning wore on, the Americans faced a dilemma: press forward into engagement despite the risk of further casualties, or withdraw to a safer position and risk losing control of the strategic pass. This decision, fraught with uncertainty, would determine the outcome of the day and shape lessons for future military operations. Soldiers, exhausted and weary, waited for orders. Their fates balanced precariously between action and inaction. What began as a confident patrol had spiraled into a deadly test of nerves. Every step forward risked walking into disaster. Yet the American soldiers had no choice but to adapt or be overwhelmed. The Americans, now fully aware of the enemy's presence, scrambled to stabilize their position. Colonel Benjamin Walker moved swiftly among his officers, issuing orders to form defensive lines while trying to maintain coordination between infantry, artillery, and supply units. The initial overconfidence had given way to an acute awareness of vulnerability. Every moment, without careful observation, could prove fatal. The terrain, initially assumed to be an asset, now presented significant challenges. Hills, ravines, and dense underbrush created obstacles for movement and communication. Musket volleys often missed their targets due to limited visibility, and the sound of gunfire echoed unpredictably through the forest, making it difficult to distinguish friend from foe. Officers had to rely on experience, judgment, and quick improvisation to prevent further chaos. Artillery crews, previously confident, now faced the daunting task of repositioning under fire. Cannons were heavy and cumbersome, and moving them through rough terrain while avoiding enemy musket shots required coordination and courage. Yet these adjustments proved essential. By relocating to higher ground with clear lines of sight, artillery units could deliver precise, suppressive fire that slowed the enemy's advance and gave the infantry room to maneuver. Despite these measures, casualties continued to mount. Soldiers described the surreal experience of being under attack from multiple directions, trying to maintain formation while protecting wounded comrades and supply wagons. The psychological strain was immense. Fear, exhaustion, and confusion combined to create a battlefield atmosphere that was as dangerous as the physical threats. In letters and journals, many soldiers reflected on the thin line between panic and discipline, realizing that survival depended on their ability to stay calm and follow orders under extreme pressure. The enemy, realizing that the Americans were regrouping, adapted their tactics. Skirmishers attempted to flank the ridge, using hidden trails to approach American positions undetected. Cavalry units probed weak points in the defensive lines, forcing the Americans to divert attention and resources. Each move tested the adaptability and resilience of the troops, revealing both the strengths and vulnerabilities of their organization. Amid the chaos, acts of bravery and ingenuity emerged. Small groups of soldiers created barricades using fallen trees and rocks, while others laid down covering fire to allow comrades to reposition or retreat safely. Officers risked exposure to rally their men and coordinate defensive maneuvers, demonstrating leadership under fire. These actions, though often unrecorded in official histories, were decisive in preventing a total collapse of the American position. Communication remained a critical challenge. Messengers had to navigate the battlefield under fire, carrying instructions that could mean life or death. Misinterpretation of orders or delays could result in gaps in the line, making soldiers vulnerable to enemy attacks. The importance of clear, timely communication became painfully evident, highlighting a lesson that would resonate throughout future campaigns. Intelligence and coordination are as vital as courage and firepower. As the hours passed, the Americans began to stabilize their lines. Defensive positions were reinforced, artillery fire became more precise, and the troops adjusted to the enemy's movements. While the battle was far from over, the immediate threat of a complete rout had been mitigated. Soldiers learned to anticipate enemy maneuvers, exploit terrain advantages, and work together despite fear and exhaustion, a testament to human resilience in the face of misjudged assumptions and unexpected danger. Yet the question remained, could the Americans turn this precarious situation into a victory? Or would the enemy continue to exploit their initial overconfidence, inflicting further losses? The answer depended not only on strategy, but also on the ability of ordinary soldiers and their leaders to adapt in real time, making split-second decisions that would shape the outcome of the day. By late afternoon, the American soldiers faced a critical choice: fight through the chaos and seize control, or retreat under fire and risk losing the strategic pass entirely. Every decision now mattered. The Americans, having stabilized their defensive positions, prepared for the enemy's next maneuver. Colonel Benjamin Walker, acutely aware of the stakes, coordinated artillery fire while ordering infantry units to hold key high points. Soldiers were exhausted from hours of engagement, yet they understood that any lapse in discipline could result in disaster. The initial overconfidence that had almost led to catastrophe now fueled a careful, determined response. The British, observing the Americans' resilience, adjusted their tactics. They sought to exploit weak points in the line, sending skirmishers to create diversions while maneuvering larger units to threaten flanks. The Americans, anticipating these moves, reinforced vulnerable positions and used terrain to their advantage. Trees, ridges, and ravines became tools in a defensive chess game, transforming what had been a trap into a controlled contest of strategy and nerve. Artillery played a crucial role in this turning point. Relocated to commanding positions, American cannons delivered well-aimed fire that disrupted enemy advances and forced temporary retreats. Infantry units, emboldened by this support, countered the flanking maneuvers with disciplined volleys, gradually regaining lost ground. The tide of battle began to shift, demonstrating how leadership, adaptability, and coordination could offset the disadvantage caused by earlier misjudgments. Despite these gains, casualties continued to mount. Soldiers who had been confident in the morning now grappled with exhaustion, injury, and the psychological toll of prolonged engagement. The chaotic nature of battle fog, smoke, erratic musket fire, and hidden threats made every step perilous. Yet, amid fear and fatigue, acts of bravery emerged. Officers led from the front, inspiring their men, while small groups of soldiers performed critical maneuvers that preserved key positions and prevented the enemy from exploiting gaps. The confrontation reached its climax as the Americans executed a coordinated countermeasure. Infantry advanced in synchronized formations while artillery provided suppressive fire, disrupting the enemy's cohesion. The British, surprised by the Americans' resilience and adaptation, began a measured withdrawal to avoid further casualties. What had started as a near disaster transformed into a defensive success, with the strategic pass ultimately retained by American forces. The aftermath of the battle provided lasting lessons: overconfidence, reliance on incomplete intelligence, and assumptions about enemy strength had nearly led to catastrophe. Yet, the ability of soldiers and commanders to adapt, communicate, and improvise under pressure salvaged the situation. The incident became a valuable case study in military strategy. Preparation and caution are critical, but adaptability and resilience are equally essential. Personal accounts highlight the human dimension of this experience. Letters and diaries recount the terror of being caught off guard, the adrenaline of countering the enemy, and the camaraderie that sustained soldiers through prolonged fear. These stories emphasize that even in engagements lacking widespread fame or dramatic victories, the lessons learned and human experiences can be profound and enduring. Reflecting on this incident, one realizes that history often rewards those who combine preparation with adaptability. The Americans' near defeat illustrates the dangers of underestimating the enemy, while their eventual recovery showcases the resilience and ingenuity that have characterized successful military operations throughout history. It also reminds us that mistakes, even when costly, can serve as catalysts for growth, innovation, and a deeper understanding of leadership under pressure. Imagine marching hundreds of miles, expecting to fight a well-fed and ready army, only to discover that your supplies, your food, ammunition, and essentials never arrived. This is the story of how logistical mismanagement nearly doomed an entire American force. It was the bitter winter of 1777, and American troops were stationed in a remote region of upstate New York, tasked with holding a critical frontier post against British forces. The army, already fatigued by months of campaigning, relied heavily on supply lines stretching hundreds of miles from major depots along the Hudson River. These lines were the lifeblood of the operation. Without them, soldiers would be left to endure harsh winter conditions, scarce rations, and dwindling morale. At first, everything seemed in order. Supply convoys were dispatched, carrying flour, salted meat, hardtack, and other essentials. Officers assured troops that deliveries would arrive on schedule, and soldiers prepared to maintain defensive positions while awaiting resupply. Confidence, however, masked the underlying vulnerabilities of the operation. Roads were poorly maintained, transport wagons were slow and prone to break down, and communication with distant depots was unreliable. The first warning of trouble came with minor delays. Wagons carrying essential provisions arrived late, some missing key items, and messengers reported impassable roads due to snow and ice. Soldiers, initially patient, began to feel uneasy. Hunger set in, and morale declined as daily rations were reduced in anticipation of the delayed shipments. Officers attempted to reassure their men, but the growing uncertainty about supplies introduced tension into the ranks. Meanwhile, the British, aware of the logistical vulnerabilities in the American positions, observed quietly. Intelligence from local loyalists confirmed that the Americans were heavily dependent on their supply lines and, that delays could create opportunities for offensive action. What the Americans saw as a minor inconvenience, the British recognized as a potential strategic advantage. As the weeks passed, the situation worsened. Wagon after wagon failed to reach the frontier post on schedule. Blizzards and icy roads halted progress, and some convoys were intercepted by British raiding parties, leaving supplies in enemy hands. Soldiers began improvising, foraging for firewood, melting snow for water, and rationing what little food remained. The hardship was palpable. Diaries from the period describe soldiers scavenging for edible roots, attempting to stretch meager rations, and enduring frostbite, fatigue, and illness. Commanders faced difficult decisions. They could attempt to send smaller, faster convoys through dangerous terrain, risking the lives of supply teams, or continue to wait for delayed shipments, gambling that troops could survive until regular resupply resumed. The decision weighed heavily. A miscalculation could result in starvation, weakened defense, or even surrender. The logistical failure threatened not only the army as operational effectiveness, but the very survival of its soldiers in the harsh winter environment. The consequences of the blunder were immediate and severe. Troops grew weaker, morale plummeted, and discipline began to fray under the constant stress of hunger and exhaustion. Minor disputes escalated into near mutinies as soldiers protested the lack of food and basic necessities. Officers struggled to maintain order, recognizing that the army's cohesion was being eroded not by enemy action, but by preventable human error. Amid the struggle, ingenuity and resilience emerged. Soldiers hunted game, fished frozen rivers, and created makeshift shelters to survive the harsh conditions. Officers redistributed remaining rations, prioritized care for the sick and injured, and organized work details to improve roads and paths for future supply convoys. These adaptive measures, though insufficient to restore full provisions, demonstrated the capacity of humans to endure extreme adversity and improvise solutions in the face of critical shortages. Historians often overlook this kind of logistical failure, focusing instead on heroic battles and grand strategies. Yet the story of this near starvation illustrates a fundamental truth. Armies are only as strong as their support systems. Even the most disciplined soldiers and competent commanders can be rendered ineffective when supply lines fail. The incident serves as a reminder that war is not won solely on the battlefield. Planning, coordination, and foresight in seemingly mundane aspects like delivering food and ammunition can determine the outcome of entire campaigns. As winter deepened, the American forces faced a pressing question. Could they endure until new supplies arrived, or would the combination of starvation, illness, and low morale force a retreat or surrender? The answer was uncertain, hanging precariously on the ingenuity and resilience of ordinary soldiers and the decisions of their commanders. This looming uncertainty set the stage for both desperate improvisation and moments of remarkable human endurance that would define the campaign. The cold was relentless, the rations nearly gone, and every soldier knew that failure to adapt could mean starvation or worse. Yet amid the desperation, human ingenuity and resilience began to surface in remarkable ways. By midwinter, the situation had deteriorated dramatically. Supply convoys remained delayed. Roads were blocked by snowdrifts, and scouts reported that British forces were monitoring the American position closely. Soldiers were down to minimal rations, often forced to subsist on small amounts of hardtack, spoiled meat, or whatever they could forage from the frozen landscape. Hunger gnawed constantly, and morale declined with each passing day. Commanders recognized that traditional logistics were failing. Colonel Jonathan Pierce, tasked with maintaining order and operational readiness, called an emergency council of officers. Together, they devised a series of adaptive strategies to ensure survival while maintaining defensive positions. One critical decision was to organize foraging parties to search for any edible resources, from frozen game to edible roots and wild plants. These foraging expeditions were risky. Soldiers had to navigate treacherous terrain under harsh weather conditions, with the constant threat of enemy patrols. Yet the men demonstrated remarkable ingenuity, fashioning snares, fishing through frozen rivers, and even repurposing materials from abandoned structures to improve shelters and protect themselves from the biting cold. Diaries from the period recount long, grueling days spent hunting, digging for edible roots, and sharing meager finds among comrades, a stark reminder of how ordinary humans adapt to extraordinary adversity. Within the army, a spirit of solidarity emerged. Soldiers shared their rations, took turns tending to the sick, and helped each other construct makeshift shelters. Leadership at the lower levels proved as critical as command decisions from above. Non-commissioned officers organized small squads, ensuring that no man was left behind or forced into unnecessary danger. These micro-level acts of organization and compassion preserved both life and morale in conditions that can have easily resulted in widespread collapse. Meanwhile, the British, aware of the Americans' predicament, debated whether to launch a direct attack. They anticipated weakened forces due to hunger and exposure, yet intelligence was incomplete. The Americans, adapting to the precarious situation, remained vigilant, using their knowledge of the terrain to create defensive positions and ambush points, countering the enemy's advantage even while under extreme strain. The psychological effects of starvation and exhaustion were profound. Soldiers reported hallucinations, fatigue-induced confusion, and extreme irritability. Letters describe men rationing meager portions, fearing for their lives and those of their comrades, and reflecting on the harsh realities of war beyond the glory of battle. Yet these same letters also highlight ingenuity. Frozen rivers were melted for water, snow, and ice were insulated with straw for warmth. And small victories like capturing a rabbit or finding a stash of potatoes became moments of profound relief. Commanders implemented additional measures to maintain discipline and effectiveness. Drill routines were adjusted to conserve energy. Guard rotations were optimized to reduce exposure. And morale-boosting initiatives such as storytelling around fires and communal sharing of small comforts helped sustain cohesion. These seemingly minor interventions had an outsized impact. While the army was hungry and cold, it remained organized and capable of defending against potential British offensives. Despite these adaptations, the looming question remained: could the army survive until the supply lines were restored? Or would the cumulative effects of hunger, fatigue, and exposure force a retreat or surrender? Every decision, from ration distribution to patrol assignments, carried immense weight, as the margin between survival and disaster was razor thin. The soldiers' ingenuity, determination, and mutual support were constantly tested against the unforgiving environment and the pressure of enemy observation. Historians highlight that this episode, while lacking the dramatic heroics of battlefield maneuvers, exemplifies the critical importance of logistics, planning, and human resilience. Armies are often celebrated for victories in combat, but the ability to endure hardship, improvise solutions, and maintain cohesion in the face of supply failures can be just as decisive in shaping history. This campaign became a vivid lesson. Even a well-trained army is vulnerable when basic necessities are compromised, and survival depends on both leadership and the adaptive capacities of ordinary soldiers. The frozen landscape stretched endlessly. Rations had dwindled to almost nothing, and every soldier knew that one misstep could cost lives. Survival and the army's ability to hold the frontier hung by a thread. By late winter, the American Army's situation had reached a critical point. Supplies were nearly exhausted, and the soldiers' strength was waning. Hunger and exhaustion had taken a toll on morale and physical condition alike. Frostbite, illness, and fatigue plagued the troops, and commanders faced the terrifying prospect that a single British offensive could wipe out the weakened force. Colonel Jonathan Pierce, recognizing the gravity of the situation, coordinated an extraordinary series of measures to ensure survival. Soldiers were organized into small, highly disciplined squads for foraging expeditions, using knowledge of the local terrain to locate hidden food sources. Teams ventured into frozen forests, carefully tracking game and identifying edible plants, roots, and berries every meal, however meager, was rationed meticulously, ensuring that as many men as possible could survive until supplies arrived. Innovation became a matter of life and death. Soldiers melted snow for water, insulated themselves with straw and scraps of cloth, and even crafted makeshift stoves to prepare the small amounts of food they could find. Messengers were sent in pairs to ensure critical communication between units, as a lost or delayed message could result in disaster. These measures, while simple, reflected extraordinary human ingenuity under extreme conditions. The soldiers' perseverance was remarkable. Despite weakness and frostbite, they continued to maintain defensive positions along the frontier, ready to repel any British advance. Every action was calculated, every step measured, even small successes catching a rabbit, finding a cache of potatoes, or redistributing a slightly larger ration brought hope and renewed determination. In letters and diaries, soldiers often reflected that these minor victories were as significant as any battlefield triumph, illustrating the human capacity to endure extreme adversity. Eventually, after weeks of hardship, relief arrived. Supply convoys, delayed by snow, ice, and enemy harassment, finally reached the army. Wagons unloaded flour, salted meat, ammunition, and essential equipment. The impact on morale was immediate and profound. Soldiers regained strength, morale soared, and the army's operational capacity was restored. The crisis, which had seemed insurmountable, was mitigated through a combination of leadership, resilience, and extraordinary human ingenuity. The lessons of the supply blunder were far-reaching. Military historians emphasize that logistical failures can be as dangerous as enemy action. An army can be well-trained, disciplined, and courageous, yet rendered ineffective without adequate planning, coordination, and support. The campaign demonstrated that survival in warfare often depends on the ability to adapt to unforeseen challenges, improvise solutions, and maintain cohesion even under extreme pressure. Equally significant were the human stories that emerged. Soldiers' letters capture moments of desperation and ingenuity, from hunting frozen game to sharing dwindling rations with comrades. Officers' reflections highlight the challenges of leadership in crises where survival, rather than victory, is the primary concern. These accounts provide invaluable insight into the human experience of war, the endurance, ingenuity, and camaraderie that allow ordinary individuals to persevere in extraordinary circumstances. Reflecting on this episode, one sees that history is shaped not only by battles won or lost, but by the ability of individuals and organizations to survive, adapt, and respond to unforeseen challenges. The Army's near starvation illustrates that victory is often as much about preparation, logistics, and human resilience as it is about strategy or force of arms. Ordinary soldiers, through their endurance and innovation, preserved the Army and ensured that it could continue to defend the frontier. One wrong word, a delayed message, or a courier lost on the road. Sometimes it isn't the enemy that destroys an army, but its own confusion. This is the story of how miscommunication turned a battle into chaos. The year was 1778, and the Revolutionary War had reached a precarious stage. American forces, still finding their footing against the disciplined might of the British Army, relied heavily on coordination between scattered units. Orders had to travel across rugged terrain by mounted couriers, sometimes taking hours or days to reach their destination. In an era without telegraphs or radios, battles often hinged not just on bravery or firepower, but on whether a messenger survived the journey. One particular campaign in New Jersey would reveal the catastrophic consequences of this fragile system. General Charles Mercer had been tasked with defending a vital crossroads against British advances. His orders were clear, or so it seemed. He was to hold the position long enough for reinforcements to arrive, ensuring the Americans maintained control of supply lines feeding the northern colonies. The crossroads was unremarkable in appearance, little more than a cluster of dirt roads and scattered farms. But strategically, It was the artery that kept American forces supplied and mobile. The plan depended on precise timing. General Mercer would hold the crossroads with 1,500 men while reinforcements from General Elias Worth's division marched from the north. Meanwhile, a smaller detachment under Colonel Everett was ordered to harass British flanks to delay their approach. On paper, the coordination was elegant. 3 groups working together to stall, resist, and counter British movement, but where seldom goes according to plan. The first problem emerged with the orders themselves. General Worth's reinforcements received a delayed dispatch to courier carrying. Mercer's message was intercepted by Loyalist scouts, forcing another messenger to be sent hours later. By the time Worth understood the urgency, he was already behind schedule. His division would not reach the crossroads in time. Colonel Everett's detachment, meanwhile, misinterpreted their instructions. The vague wording, "disrupt enemy movements at will," left Everett uncertain whether to engage directly or simply shadow the British. He chose caution, harassing small groups but avoiding open confrontation. While this preserved his force, it also allowed the British to advance largely unimpeded. At the crossroads, Mercer held his ground, confident that reinforcements were en route. His men dug shallow defenses, positioned artillery, and prepared for an extended fight. But as hours passed with no sign of Worth's division, anxiety grew. Scouts reported the British advancing in greater numbers than expected, and supplies of ammunition were already being strained by skirmishes. Then came the breaking point, a misinterpreted order delivered at the worst possible time. A courier, exhausted from a long ride and confused by overlapping instructions, reported to Mercer that Worth's forces were close behind. Believing reinforcements were imminent, Mercer decided to commit his troops to a more aggressive position, moving forward from the crossroads into open fields. It was a bold maneuver had reinforcements actually been nearby, but Worth was still miles away. When the British arrived, they found Mercer's men exposed, stretched thin across terrain that offered little cover. The resulting clash was brutal. American units, expecting support, instead faced disciplined volleys and coordinated British bayonet charges. Casualties mounted quickly, and the illusion of reinforcements shattered as soldiers realized they were alone. Panic began to ripple through the ranks. Yet, even in the midst of disaster, the Americans demonstrated remarkable resilience. Officers rallied their men. Artillery crews fired until their guns overheated, and soldiers fought fiercely to hold ground they had been told was vital. The spirit was willing, but the coordination was broken. What might have been a strategic delay turned into a desperate fight for survival, with communication failures compounding every mistake. As dusk fell, Mercer's troops pulled back toward the crossroads. Battered but unbroken, they had lost the forward ground, suffered heavy casualties, and morale was shaken. Yet they still held part of the position, clinging to the hope that reinforcements might arrive before the British could deliver a final blow. The Crossroads campaign had already exposed the cracks in communication, but the full disaster was still unfolding. Would Worth arrive in time? Could Everett's detachment disrupt the British advance enough to buy a few more hours? Or had miscommunication doomed the defense entirely? Imagine fighting with all your strength only to realize you've been following the wrong plan. In war, miscommunication doesn't just create confusion, it creates disaster. The night after the bloody clash in the open fields was a restless one for General Mercer's men. Campfires flickered faintly, though many soldiers were too exhausted or wounded to tend them. The crossroads itself had become a grim staging ground, scattered with broken wagons, torn uniforms, and hastily dug graves. Officers moved among the men, whispering words of encouragement, though their faces betrayed the same doubts their soldiers carried. For Mercer, the burden was heavier than most. He had been assured that reinforcements under General Worth were en route, yet the horizon remained empty, and scouts sent northward returned with troubling reports. Worth's division was delayed, perhaps by as much as an entire day. This was a devastating revelation. The crossroads could not be held indefinitely, not with dwindling supplies, low morale, and the certainty of renewed British attacks come dawn. Worse still, Colonel Everett's detachment was nowhere to be found. According to the plan, Everett's men were to harass the British flanks, buying precious time for Mercer's defense. Instead, Everett had pulled back after a minor skirmish, choosing to preserve his numbers rather than risk. Engagement, his caution, while understandable, left Mercer dangerously exposed. The combined effect of these absent allies created a picture of an army fractured not by defeat, but by disjointed communication. By sunrise, British forces resumed their advance. Drums rolled across the misty fields, and red-coated infantry marched in disciplined lines. Unlike the weary Americans, the British were well-rested, supplied, and confident. Mercer's forward artillery opened fire, the thunderous roar echoing across the valley. But with limited ammunition, every shot had to count. It was at this critical moment that another courier arrived, bearing a fresh set of orders that would only deepen the chaos. The message, written in haste and smudged with dirt, seemed to instruct Mercer to hold position until Worth strikes the enemy flank. To Mercer, this confirmed that reinforcements were indeed imminent. What he did not realize, however, was that the note was outdated. Worth's own understanding of the battle had shifted after receiving conflicting intelligence, and his movements were not coordinated with Mercer's defense. Thus, Mercer fought under the illusion of a plan that no longer existed. The Americans braced themselves as the British surged forward. Muskets fired in volleys, smoke clouded the fields, and the ground trembled with the charge of bayonets. Mercer's men resisted fiercely, using the limited cover of fences and shallow earthworks. But each wave of British assault chipped away at their fragile defense. Soldiers shouted for reinforcements that never came, their voices drowned out by the clash of steel and the cries of the wounded. Amid this chaos, smaller failures of communication compounded the disaster. One regiment, mishearing an order to hold the left, interpreted it as a command to fall back left. They withdrew prematurely, creating a gap in the line. The British, ever observant, exploited the opening, forcing Mercer to scramble his reserves to plug the breach every misheard. Word became a crack in the defense, and with each passing hour, those cracks widened. Colonel Everett, meanwhile, finally recognized the urgency of his mission. Reports of Mercer's desperate stand reached him, and he resolved to act. Yet even his intervention was marked by confusion. Lacking clear directions, Everett marched his detachment toward the crossroads, only to arrive on the wrong flank. Instead of striking the British rear as intended, he stumbled directly into their reserves. His men fought valiantly but were quickly repelled, their contribution little more than a diversion that briefly distracted the enemy. General Worth's division was still miles away, burdened by muddy roads, conflicting orders, and fatigue. His soldiers advanced at a crawl. He knew Mercer was engaged, but underestimated the scale of the battle. By the time he realized the urgency, the sun was already beginning to set. Back at the crossroads, Mercer's situation had become untenable. Ammunition was critically low, rations were gone, and casualties mounted with every passing hour. His officers debated retreat, but Mercer resisted. Abandoning the crossroads meant ceding a vital artery to the British, a loss that could cripple American mobility in the region. Yet to stay meant destruction. The breaking point came when British artillery finally arrived on the field. Until then, Mercer's defenders had enjoyed a slim advantage with their few cannons. Now, under a barrage of superior British firepower, their defenses crumbled, trees splintered, fences shattered, and makeshift earthworks disintegrated under the relentless bombardment. Soldiers who had once fought bravely now looked over their shoulders, wondering if escape was even possible. Still, Mercer clung to hope. Somewhere out there, Worth was marching. Somewhere out there, Everett was regrouping. If only they could arrive before nightfall, perhaps the crossroads could yet be saved. But as the day wore on, it became clear that reinforcements were not coming in time. The Crossroads campaign was no longer about victory. It was about survival. As dusk settled over the battlefield, Mercer faced a terrible choice: hold until annihilation, or withdraw under cover of darkness, leaving the Crossroads in enemy hands. He knew whichever path he chose would echo far beyond the night. The question hung heavy in the smoke-filled air. Would the American forces cling to the Crossroads and risk destruction, or would they retreat and endure the shame of yielding such a critical position? Sometimes in history, defeat doesn't come from a stronger enemy, but from silence, delay, and a single wrong word carried at the wrong time. This is how the Crossroads was finally lost. Nightfall brought no relief. Smoke lingered in the air, mingling with the faint glow of scattered campfires and the moans of the wounded. General Mercer stood among his officers, weary and mud-stained, his mind weighed down by the impossible choice before him. Retreat meant abandoning the very objective he had been ordered to protect. Holding meant certain destruction. As they deliberated, another courier stumbled into camp. His horse was lathered in sweat, his uniform torn, and his message half illegible from rain and mud. The words, however, were unmistakable. Worth is delayed until morning for Mercer. This was the breaking point. He realized that the entire defense had been built on a series of false expectations. He had been told reinforcements were close, yet they were not. He had believed Colonel Everett would cripple the British flanks, yet Everett had been driven off. Every decision he had made relied on orders and information that proved incomplete, outdated, or misleading. His officers pressed him to withdraw. "We cannot hold another day," one argued. "The men are exhausted, the ammunition is nearly gone, and the British will renew their attack at dawn." Others agreed, pointing out the mounting casualties and the crumbling defenses. But Mercer hesitated. His orders from higher command had been explicit: hold the Crossroads. To abandon it could bring charges of disobedience, perhaps even disgrace. Yet what good was obedience if it destroyed the army he commanded? At last, with grim resolve, Mercer gave the order. The withdrawal would begin under cover of darkness. Wounded men were loaded onto wagons, artillery pieces were spiked and abandoned, and the weary soldiers prepared to slip away quietly into the night. The retreat was chaotic. Units became separated. In the darkness, couriers failed to find their destinations, and confusion reigned once more. Some regiments marched in circles, mistaking one dirt track for another. Others panicked at rumors of British pursuit and fled in disorder. By dawn, Mercer's army was scattered and broken, its cohesion lost as completely as the Crossroads itself. When General Worth finally arrived later that morning, he found only silence. The Crossroads was deserted, its defenses abandoned, and the British already consolidating their position. Worth's men, still weary from their long march, could do nothing to reverse the loss. The Crossroads campaign was over, not with a climactic last stand, but with a retreat born of miscommunication and delay. The consequences rippled far beyond the battlefield. The British now controlled a vital artery, allowing them to move supplies and troops with greater ease across New Jersey. American forces in the region were forced into more difficult terrain, their movements restricted, their morale shaken. Soldiers whispered bitterly about the failure of their leaders, blaming Worth for his delay, Everett for his caution, and Mercer for trusting orders that no longer reflected reality. Historians later dissected the episode as a classic case of miscommunication in war. There had been no great tactical genius on the British side, no overwhelming numbers or surprise maneuvers. Instead, the Americans had defeated themselves through missed couriers, vague orders, and the simple failure to confirm information before acting. It was a lesson repeated throughout history. Wars are not only fought with muskets and cannons, but also with words, signals, and messages. A single delay, a single misunderstood command, can unravel the plans of thousands. For Mercer, the legacy was bittersweet. Though he had preserved part of his force through retreat, his reputation never recovered. The Crossroads became a symbol of failure, not of courage or resistance, but of confusion. And in that confusion lay one of the most ridiculous, yet costly, mistakes of the Revolutionary War. Reflection and CTA. Even today, in a world of instant communication, history reminds us how fragile coordination can be if a battle can be lost to a single delayed message. What other moments in history were shaped not by strength or strategy, but by silence and misunderstanding?